Thank you everybody for joining this workshop. We help researchers find new ways of introducing data and open source investigations and large data sets into their analysis and really make human rights research scalable. So I run this platform called Amnesty Decoders, and I'll tell you a little bit about what's possible and also some steps and tips if you guys are ever interested in setting up a project like that. So first of all, why we're trying to do that? I mean, I'll try to keep the presentation to about 20 minutes so then we can have a bit of time for conversation because I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. But why do we do that? We're trying to fix two problems, or not, it's one solution to some problems. One is a speed of change and data overload. So again, the traditional human rights researcher would rely on pen and paper and meeting people in the field and cultivating contacts. Nowadays, we have such vast amounts of information at our fingertip. We have every day a snapshot of every place on Earth through satellite imagery. We have every day, every minute, 500 hours of footage uploaded on YouTube. I think altogether on YouTube there's 46,000 years of footage. And that is an old statistic, I'm sure it's more than that. So it would take a person 46,000 years to go through everything on YouTube. On Facebook, there's also per minute 3.3 million posts, and on Twitter, 500,000 posts. So all these, in all this vast sea of information, there's signals about human rights violations, and we want to be able to take advantage of that. It's just that impossible to tackle the scale. Another problem we're trying to solve, in particular as Amnesty International, if you guys know us, you know that we're a campaigning organization. We have members or supporters around the world. In fact, we're funded by supporters globally. So people that donate, $5 a month to Amnesty International, that's how we fund most of the work. So for us, it's really important to engage with these supporters, to not just ask them for donations, but ask them to be part of our work. And we have a really good option to engage people offline. We have a lot of activist networks. Some of you may be part of student networks of Amnesty International. We do a lot of offline actions. But in terms of online, we didn't really quite get to that meaningful online engagement until this project. And fair enough, there have to be a wide variety of online engagements. CLICKTIVISM is one of them, but sometimes that's not enough. So we want to tackle the large scale of data available to us and engage our supporters. So these two problems together, we had this idea to use microtasking, a sort of crowdsourcing technology, to really tap into the both problems and solutions. So microtasking, and you're going to hear me a lot talk about this word, is a bit of a jargon, but it's a type of crowdsourcing, which means you take a large task, you split it into small or micro tasks, and then distribute it over the internet to many people. So everybody does a small amount of work. This is a framework we've put together at the beginning of the Amnesty Decoders project to help us analyze how we could use microtasking for human rights research. So with microtasking, we're able to analyze all sorts of data, pictures, documents, videos, satellite images, social media reports, maps. All this is unstructured data that comes in big volumes. Obviously, we can look at the variety of human rights violations, death penalty, hate speech, extractive industries, illegal demolitions. These are just some examples of type of human rights violations you can work around. And then on the last column, you have the types of engagements you can do with people, with digital volunteers. You can ask digital volunteers to trace, classify, compare, count, transcribe, and so on. So for example, we could use a large database of videos to trace illegal use of weapons by asking people to identify features. You train them how a specific weapon looks like, and they watch a small amount of a video and tell you where that weapon is, if at all, in the video. Or you can use satellite images to trace displacements of people by counting, for example, tents in refugee camps. So you see how you get your unstructured data, and by engaging people to do small, simple tasks, you structure your data. And at Amnesty Decoders, we've launched the project in 2016, and we already completed several projects. I'm going to take you through some of them so you can see how we built them. And one in particular, I'm going to go a little bit deep so you see the steps we took in building a project. So one of the most recent projects we've done through Decoders was Strike Tracker. Tomorrow I have a talk on the main stage, I think it's one of the first talks, about our Raqqa investigation, and this is part of our Raqqa investigation, but if you're interested to hear more about our approach to open source investigations, you're going to hear about it then. But Strike Tracker was a project within a broader investigation on bombings led by the US in Raqqa. I don't know if you guys know much about Raqqa, but we call it the most destroyed city in modern times. Raqqa was the capital of the ISIS caliphate in Syria. Obviously, it was a problem that ISIS was there, that they declared the caliphate, and that kept people oppressed under their control. Now, a US-led coalition of states, but in particular US, UK, and France, took on to liberate Raqqa from ISIS, and the only way they saw available to do that was to give no safe haven to ISIS, which meant they destroyed almost 80% of the buildings in Raqqa. On this map, every dot you see is a building that was either damaged or destroyed in bombardments. Now, the coalition said through the war and at the end of the war that there's been no civilian casualties, that this was one of the most precise air campaigns in history, and that with this vast amount of buildings destroyed, and many of them were completely bombarded to the ground, there's just a pile of rubble where a building of 5-6 stories was, they said that there's been no casualties. Obviously, what we heard through field investigations, through lots of research, was a very different story, a story where people were hiding in basements of buildings, where they were destroyed, of entire families being decimated, and people having no place to go, because wherever they would go, that building would be destroyed. So we wanted to do a large-scale investigation to tell the story of these people that died in Raqqa as a result of the bombing. These were civilians, had nothing to do with ISIS, they were just trying to survive, moving from one building to another. Every time they moved, the building was destroyed. So for the broader investigation, we've done quite a lot of work. We've done lots of field missions. We spoke to many survivors and testimonies. We collected all the open source material available on the internet on Raqqa. We analyzed hundreds of videos, thousands of pictures, hundreds of thousands of reports, and really we put together the comprehensive story of the city. But one thing we've done as well was analysis of satellite imagery to determine when buildings were destroyed. So we had this data that tells us that in the 4 months of the campaign, so between June and October 2017, these buildings were destroyed, but we didn't know the level of destruction and we didn't know the exact date. We are advocating with the international coalition for them to take responsibility for the civilian casualties. So that meant we had to be very precise in saying people died here and tell them when they died and when the attacks happened. So that's why we needed to be very precise on the date of buildings being destroyed. So we put together this crowdsourcing project which showed people an array of satellite images of the same building over time. And people had to scroll through this historical timeline of satellite images and determine when the building was destroyed. So if you see here, this was a fairly big building, it was partially destroyed, half of it was completely downed. So people had to scroll through the image and pinpoint the date before and after destruction. And this was one of the most complex projects we've done. But because the city was destroyed to such a large degree and the destruction was so obvious, even people that had no training in using satellite images, no understanding of Raqqa and what happened there, could really participate. We invest, with all these projects, we invest quite a lot in user interface and making projects simple to use with a lot of user testing. But you see, like, because the destruction was so obvious, it was quite easy for us to do. We managed to process 2 million satellite image chips. So, you know, every one of these little squares is a chip of satellite image. We had 3,000 people from around the world participating, and altogether they gave us, you know, the equivalent of 2.5 years of one person working full time, so 4,100 hours. We also have a discussion forum. People talk a lot about it. So, all of a sudden we had all these people that were deeply passionate about what happened in Raqqa. So that was engagement that went beyond sharing or retweeting or doing any other social media analysis. People had meaningful discussions about the role of the coalition, what else could I have done, and how we bring this evidence to the coalition so they investigate further the incidents. So we managed to have a story of how the city was taken, from the outside inside. We were able to match individual testimonies collected through either social media research or direct interviews with the corresponding satellite image to see, their place and when it was destroyed, and corroborate those testimonies we had and those other reports we had about the same incident. Last year, we had another big analysis. All these projects will be completely different. Now we're in the Troll Patrol project. This is a study about online violence against women on Twitter. This was, as far as we know, the largest analysis of online abuse against women. We had 6,500 plus decoders. We had a tech partner, Element AI, worked with us. This is an artificial intelligence company that has an arm of AI for Good, so works with nonprofit organizations to leverage data and data science. We analyzed the Twitter mentions of 778 women for a whole year. Altogether, they received 14 million tweets. We analyzed a sample of 288,000. Sorry, before I go there, some of the language here is quite offensive, especially to women. If you experience online abuse, you may be triggered by that. We tried to tone it down, with comparison to what we find online, but it's still pretty offensive. So the project looked like that. We showed decoders an anonymized tweet mentioning one of the women in our study, and they had to answer some simple questions, like, can you see problematic or abusive content in this tweet? If they could see problematic or abusive content, we asked them to describe the type of abuse, so, sexism, racism, transphobia, homophobia, and so on. They also had to select whether the abuse is in the text or any other media associated with the tweet, such as an image or a video. Again, we had quite amazing engagement. We analyzed, we had 600,000 contributions from 6,000 decoders, 1.5 years, the equivalent of 1.5 years of work, and a lot of conversations again about the nature of online abuse, the responsibility of the company, how abuse is silencing for women, and how Twitter needs to balance freedom of speech and let people talk about what they want to talk while balancing as well the freedom of speech of minority groups that are being abused and harassed. What we found, this was covered extensively in the media in the last December. We found that about 1 in 14 tweets mentioning these women, so 7% or 1.1 million in terms of volume, was either problematic or abusive. Very shockingly, and probably not, perhaps not that shockingly, but really striking was the finding that Black women really were bearing the brunt of online abuse. So they were 80% more likely to receive abusive tweets than white women. So women were altogether, had a vast amount of abuse, but Black women were the most abused. I don't know if I have it here, but the report was featured so much in the media that Twitter ended up losing 13% of their shares as a direct consequence of this report, because we had a lot of reports from women and we knew that this is a problem on Twitter, but it was the first time that somebody quantified it. So it had such a big impact because of that. So this was another project, and now I'm going to talk to you about a third project where I'm going to stop a little bit and go through the steps of the project, how we did it, not just what we did. So this was a project, again, very different, oil spills in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta. So the Niger Delta is one of the most polluted places on Earth. It's very rich in oil, and there's a lot of corporations such as Shell, Eni, and others that are exploiting oil from there for many years now. But They are very careless in working there. A lot of the pipes are broken, not well maintained, so there's hundreds of spills every year. That means that people that live in the Niger Delta can't farm, can't fish, and their land or their livelihoods are affected by the vast amount of oil leaked into their ground. There's no cleanup, there's no accountability, and there's no justice for victims. Amnesty has been working on this project for many, many years, but this was one of the latest initiatives for us. I mean, a lot of this will be familiar to you now. So, given our advocacy efforts, we managed to get companies working in the Niger Delta to have some degree of transparency around the spills. So before 2015, there were no public reports of the spills. So we knew they happened and we investigated some, but there was no knowledge about the number of spills, the size of the spills, and so on. At some point, thanks to Amnesty's advocacy, but also other organizations, at least few of the companies such as Shell and ENI, and also the Nigerian state-run company that oversees oil, they managed to put up some reports. These reports were, though, handwritten, scanned PDFs. So again, you'll be familiar with what that means, all that unstructured data, having pages and pages and pages of handwritten PDFs and having thousands of them with associated pictures. This is not easy data to process. So what I'm going to tell you is how we got from having this kind of document. So this is how an oil spill investigation report would look like. It's a form that is filled in by hand with different handwritings, of course. And also different companies have different forms. And together with the form, we had pictures of the spill. This is a picture of a pipeline that is cut. This is a picture of a pipeline that is being tapped into. And again, another one. So how did we get from this kind of pile of unstructured data to a structured database that then we could query, investigate, look for inconsistencies in their reports, and so on. So the first thing we ever do, so these are the steps. I'm going to take you through 5 steps of setting up projects like that. The first thing we always do with these kind of projects is do a risk assessment. So the last thing we want is to do a project engaging thousands of people around the world that puts them at risk, for any reason. So we have to really put a lot of emphasis on the risk assessment, and we have a meeting with a lot of stakeholders, different people from IT specialists to data scientists to project and advocacy specialists, campaigners, and think of all the possible ways a project can go wrong. And it's a very depressing step, but it's an important one to take. So we look into the sensitivity of the project and the graphic nature. So projects can be too sensitive to open up to public. We may do research that we're not ready yet to open up to the public. We can't show everybody that we're working on that. We sometimes do research that is too graphic. We look at extrajudicial killings, so we have to analyze hundreds of videos of torture, killings. Of course, we would never engage the public in projects like that. We would never show volunteers around the world, untrained volunteers. We would never show that kind of footage. So there are some projects that we have to say no to for crowdsourcing. But we always have to assess the sensitivity and the graphic nature. Of course, we have to ask ourselves, again, are we putting users at risk in any ways? For example, in certain countries, people cannot be associated with doing any work for Amnesty International. That would in itself put them at risk. We have to think about whether we collect their usernames or emails and how we store that data, and how we would ever or share or not share that data. So we have to really think of all the ways we could potentially put people at risk by asking them to volunteer for us. People may really want to volunteer for us, but we may have to put some barriers in place. When you launch a crowdsourcing project, you have to be able to engage people. When you ask people's contribution, that will come with questions from them, that will come with requests from them, and you have to be able to engage with those questions, with those requests, and broadly engage with the people that work with you, that give you so much of their time and so much of their energy. So we work with a team of volunteers that manage our forum, that work really closely with us to make sure that every question has an answer when we run projects. This is a question I get all the time, is how do you verify contributions from untrained users? So that's something that any crowdsourcing project has to feature. How do you take things from people out there? They are not people with 2 PhDs and a specialty in the region or the area you're working on. So how do you make sure they are right? So there's few things we do on that. We make the task really, really simple. And make sure that anybody can contribute. Every task is seen by multiple people, so we have a lot of redundancy in the data, and then we calculate agreement between all the people that look at the data. We also have experts contributing to the project, and we always assess agreement among the crowd, agreement between the crowd and experts, and agreement amongst experts. So we use statistical tools to ensure that our findings are solid. And of course, you have to think about risk of malicious attacks and misuse of the data. When we did the project on online violence against women, we knew that opens up, a whole network of trolls that may want to participate in our project. So we had to do all sorts of things like monitor the traffic, ban certain known bad IPs from participating in the project, put up a CAPTCHA so we are not opening ourselves up for bots contributing to the project. We do a lot of checks post-processing on the data to see whether we have consistent mistakes from certain users. We may choose to eliminate users altogether if we see kind of malicious contributions in there. But all these are risks, and all these can make or break a project, and you have to think about it beforehand and come up with a plan of how you mitigate those risks. I'm the type of person that thinks that unless the project is too graphic, you can go around risks and you can always find solutions, but it's really important to have that step. All right, so we've done that. We decided that our project is go. We had our mitigation strategy for all the risks. We put all sorts of measures in place. Now, the first important step we took was to define the task. So what do we ask people to do? In microtasking, what is the microtask? What do we want people to do? So these were very, very lengthy documents, 10, 12 pages, depending on the spiel, depending on the company, with quite a lot of information in there, but not all of it was useful. We have a data minimalist approach. And I always have to kind of argue with researchers at Amnesty. They want everything, and I have to keep them, are you really going to use that data? So what we do typically, we do an iterative series of workshops, and I get them to focus on what they really need and what data they really need for their research, so that they can achieve some change in the area they're working on. So what are the facts that you need for the findings and for your advocacy campaign? We chose to focus on, we did kind of 3 small projects. People could choose to help us understand the cause of spills or the location of the spills or analyze the image. Based on what they were choosing, we showed them a highlighted section of the report where the information was for that question, and they had to, simply select from a menu what they were seeing. This was, unless the other projects that I showed you, like the RACA project was quite complex. People had to look at satellite images. You have to kind of train your eye a bit before. The online abuse project was quite subjective. It was, we had to accept that we'll have a variety of opinions, and there's no one single truth of what is abusive to people. But this one was pretty simple. It was, handwritten copy, basically what's in the document. So very, very high levels of accuracy in this project. So again, we had 3 little tasks, and the way we defined those was through a series of workshops and by honing in on what's really useful, not what's interesting, because people will find, that would be so interesting. So I had to push people to say, okay, it's interesting, we all agree it's interesting, is it useful? are you going to really use, can you show me how are you going to visualize that data and how you're going to use it for your research? And that made a difference. Okay, we had the task. We knew we want all these documents. We wanted to show people a specific part of the document and get them to tell us, to basically copy what they see. Now, what we needed to get all this data, all these documents were living on the sites of Shell and Eni. Of course, we had the option to direct people to these websites, which may have generated a lot of traffic and interest. All of a sudden, these documents, I'm sure nobody looks at them, and it would have been quite fun to direct people on the sites of Shell and Eni, and for them to see a spike. It's like, oh, why? Why do people want all of a sudden our documents? But that meant that there was a risk that they would just turn off the pipe and say, like, yeah, documents are not available anymore. So we had to scrape them. Now, scraping is great, highly advise doing scraping, but check the terms and conditions before. In our case, the terms and conditions said that you can look at the documents one at a time on their website, or maybe save one for research purposes, but they absolutely forbade us doing a mass download. So what do you do in this case? Like, we are fortunate to have a legal team at Amnesty, and we consulted the legal team, and they gave us the green light to go ahead and take these documents because they really don't belong to the company. These are the results of a public investigation done in partnership with local communities, and they are in public interest. So Shell can't really copyright this public interest information, and if they do, if they take us to court, I mean, maybe it's even good for us because they give us a lot of visibility on the project, and we knew we're on the right side, again, because of the public interest. But, important to check the T's and C's before you use any data out there. That complicates a lot of things, but if you want to put results out there, it's an important step. So we took all these documents. What we saw, the most annoying thing was that these documents didn't have a standardized template. So, question 2 in 2016 was on page 1, in 2017 was on page 10. So they changed about every year, they changed template. So this, I think, is the template analysis from Shell. So we kind of had to do a bit of pre-processing of the data to understand, what information is where on the documents, and classify the different types of templates they used. Okay, now we had the question, we had the data, we had to develop an interface and develop a platform where to engage people to answer our questions and give us the data. So we have a developers team. I'll tell you in a minute about the options of platforms, and yeah, I think the most important thing is that we invest quite a lot in UX, so we have a designer as well on the team, and the UX expert that thinks about, like, really what's the smallest denominator, how do you get these tasks to be small enough so that you can engage people around them. We've worked with the engine room and put together a sort of library document about microtasking, so this is a screenshot from there. But these are all the platforms that you can use, that are available and you can use for microtasking. So Zooniverse is a really great project for microtasking or crowdsourcing in the scientific field. You can set up on their platform a project. Obviously, you'd have some limitations in what's possible, but you can use their platform for that. And they have a great community of people. And there's also Pybosa, which is another crowdsourcing platform built for this kind of projects. It's customizable, that you can use. It's open source. You can also hire them as consultants to customize it for you further. But all these are available for you to use as platforms. So the technology is not an issue. With many of these things, the technology is not an issue. An issue is designing the project, investing enough in how they look, how they feel, and will people participate. That's the make it or break it. But technology is there for you. We chose not to use these available technologies. We are instead taking open source platforms and customizing them internally, because many of these were not white labeled, so it meant we had to use the Zooniverse brand and the Zooniverse network. While Amnesty has such a large pool of supporters, we wanted to brand the platforms and use our own users instead of having to go through other third parties. But for small organizations, these are perfectly viable options. Now, we've built a platform with the tasks, with the data. What's left to do is really launch and engage people around it. So we use our sections. We have sections around the world, and they help us promote projects in countries, in language, and we have, we give them email templates, we give them, templates for social media ads. We work with partners to just spread the word. The project is out there, participate. We have our discussion forum, and one model that really works for you to understand the type of engagement you get from these kind of projects is the 99-1%. So 90% of the users will do a small amount of tasks, as you want them. It's a microtasking project. You want lots of people to do small things. So that's great, but then you have 9% of the users that will be quite passionate and will do much more than the average. They will work for, let's say, half a day. If other works for like 5 minutes, this guy will work for half a day. And then you'll have your super mega users. You'll have about 1% that get so passionate about the project that they don't let go. I had people in the All Spills project that read all the documents. Nobody at Amnesty read all the documents, but these people read all the documents. And they found incredible things that we haven't seen in the document. So, you'll always have a pool of super passionate users, and you have to dedicate more time to them to make sure they are well. So when they look at data about human rights violations, they may overdo it. They may get some vicarious trauma just through thinking and empathizing with the people on the other side of the violations. So you have to, think about how do you take care of these people that do a lot of work for you? How do you give them special jobs? So, for example, we make them moderators on our forum. So they are so passionate they know as much of the project as we know. So then we ask them to help us moderate the forum, answer other people's questions. We engage with them. I send them Christmas cards because they are so amazing. So, how do you take care of these super users and make sure they are well? And then using gamification, but using it ethically. And for example, we never put out leaderboards. We never encourage people to get to the top of the leaderboard or anything like that. We have metrics and gamification features that are around the community. So how much the community has achieved. So all the metrics are like that, and that's because of the feedback we got from people that they don't care about their own. They don't want to hit a target of how many tasks they do, but they care about how much collectively they do for Amnesty, and that's pretty amazing. So again, this project had about 3,500 people involved. Lots of questions answered, and really broad. We had people from the Niger Delta, from Nigeria, but also from Netherlands, France, UK, everywhere around the world. And then, of course, you have to verify the data, so run all those statistical analysis and checks, and then publish your results. In this case, we could claim negligence on behalf of the companies. We saw inconsistencies in the data they published. We asked the Nigerian government to open up 100 spills investigations where we saw that the company said that the spill was due to people tapping into their people vandalizing their pipelines, but actually it was their own fault. The pictures showed clear signs of corrosion, of lack of maintenance. They showed how some pipelines are repeatedly leaking because of poor maintenance. So we could really claim negligence on behalf of the companies. So yeah, these are my contact details. If you want to stay in touch, I'd be more than happy to on Twitter or on email. But I think we still have maybe 10 minutes for questions, if you have any.
Yeah, I'd just a lot of volunteers here. How do you check if the data is collected correct?
Yeah, every single task is done by multiple people, and we check the agreement between these people, between themselves and our experts that contribute to the project. So we have a statistical measure of accuracy. but I mean, this is the main verification method, and we do a lot of checks. What we've noticed by doing this analysis was that individually, decoders are quite poor. You know, individually, one by one, if you take them, they're not great. If you take them as a community, it really works. They become very accurate. So that's really the power of having lots of contributions. So of course, if you take the first person that tells you something, they make a mistake, you know, just because they are tired or because they don't understand the task or whatever. But when you have multiple people looking at it and people with a very diverse background, you start getting very accurate. So that's what we've seen by looking at the data, and we work with statisticians to do that. There are statistical measures that we deploy. It's called inter-rater reliability tools. So yeah.
So I'm just curious. So was this all projects were in English?
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, we don't run. So yeah, unfortunately, that's a limitation because we never managed, it's such a complexity to translate projects in different languages, and some are not really possible to translate. For example, when we looked at the abuse online, the tweets were of English and US politicians, so they were in English. Even if we managed to translate the platform, people still had to speak English to understand the tweets. We did manage to localize, so we did a follow-up of that study in India, and we did manage to localize in 9 languages the tweets themselves, but the platform was still in English. So for now, yeah, it's a complexity that we didn't explore much.
Right. So that's a filter, right? That's the biggest filter because people who don't speak English.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have to accept that.
That also tells you something about activity and engagement, right? I mean, you have only idea how people are engaged only about those who speak English or understand English, right?
Yeah, we have people that are speaking enough English to be able to participate, and on the forum we have discussions in other languages, and people help each other quite a lot. But of course, you have to have at least a basic understanding of English so you can understand the instructions, the definitions, and what's happening on the platform. But even if it's an English-speaking group, we have a very, very, very broad diversity of countries and backgrounds and ages, and so I understand there's a limitation, but it's a very diverse group.
I want to know what happens next, like when the results are revealed and everything's calculated, and like we know that there was a collusion. What happens after the results?
Well, Amnesty does a lot of advocacy based on the results. So we are an evidence-based campaigning organization. We do research, and we take that research to stakeholders that can do something about it. So, for example, in the case of Raqqa, we established that over 1,600 people died in Raqqa, and we have hundreds of incidents documented with location, names of victims, what happened to them, what kind of weapon was used for that. So we take all that documentation, and we use it to press the coalition to accept these cases, to acknowledge that they happened, because right now they say nobody died, and then to give compensations to these communities. So, we would take the evidence and do what we do with any traditional research: advocate, campaign, press, and make sure, not let go until something happens. And I mean, if you work in human rights, you'll know that change is incredibly slow, but we have to persevere, and we have to, it's the only way to show the evidence. And the fact that we are able now to process very large amounts of evidence, it's a big step forward. All right, I think time is here now. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed it.